Well, greetings and salutations, everyone, and welcome to today's bonus upload. Before we jump into it, a couple links. As many of you know, I rely on Patreon, PayPal, channel membership, and the merch to help the channel to continue to grow and go. Links to Patreon, PayPal, and channel membership is in the description below. Merch displayed directly under the video. Also, Dogman Frightening Encounters, Volume 1 through 3, the audiobook versions. They were written and researched by Tom Lyons, narrated and produced by me, Jeff Nadolny. Those audiobooks are available on Audible, Amazon, and iTunes, links to which are also in the description as well. And finally, last but definitely not least, if you'd really like to help support the channel to continue to grow and go, simply subscribe. It does not cost a cent. Click the like button, takes half a second. If you don't want to miss out on any of the informative uploads I put out daily, click that bell icon. And folks, please leave a comment and share this video. Why? Well, because all of these things really do help the channel to continue to grow and go. And yes, folks, they definitely do matter. Now, everyone, I have taken far too much of your time. Let's jump in to today's bonus, shall we? Today's first encounter. Richard stepped out of his home in rural Wisconsin into the cool night to look for a tool he had left in the backyard. Searching in the darkness, he was hit by an immense and nearly overpowering wave of primal fear. His senses sharpened as his fight-or-flight response went into full power. Something large, walking on two legs, came around the corner from his right rear. It ducked back and glared at him. As his pupils dilated, Richard could see its long snout, pointed ears, and massive frame. Something told him to quickly look to his front, and he saw another. Scanning his surroundings, he noticed three more, all now maneuvering toward him. Richard, a correctional officer, has been through all high-risk, high-threat training offered as a member of his prison's emergency response unit. He also trains working dogs and maintains a kennel on his property. Better than most of us, he understands canine behavior and the predatory instincts of a killer. Fortunately for him, that life experience kicked in as the five creatures surrounded him. He focused, calmed himself, and assumed an assertive posture and mindset. "Knock it off, I'm not running," he said. He spoke firmly and confidently, just as he would to an aggressive dog or inmate, and it worked. The creatures stopped and slowly retreated. So did Richard, back into the safety of his home. It wasn't the first time he had seen a dogman, nor would it be his last. Today's second encounter. A few SWAT deputies conducting sniper and observer training in the swamps near Shreveport, Louisiana, reported their encounter. The deputies spotted an upright dogman and watched it move in their direction. When the creature got too close for comfort, they broke cover and entered a creek bed to make their escape, at which time they were spotted by the dogman, who had paralleled them from the bank above. One of the deputies fired a round over the head of the dogman in an attempt to scare it off. Far from having the desired effect, a second dogman appeared and sniffed the air to determine where the shot had come from. Coming to within a few feet of the camouflaged and concealed men, the deputies froze, and after about a minute the second dogman walked over to the first, and the pair retreated calmly into the nearby woodline. The deputies waited another 5 minutes before they withdrew to their patrol vehicles and departed the area. Today's third encounter. This story my grandfather told me. In 1940, he volunteered for active duty and was later shipped off to Camp Stewart, Georgia. He had graduated high school in New York City the year before and thought that the U.S. would be fighting in a war eventually. So he signed up before he was drafted. At the time, he was part of an anti-aircraft training unit that was housed in large tents. Camp Stewart, now Fort Stewart, was fairly a new facility, and much of it was under construction. Most of the tents were in or near an area that was densely forested. I don't know how many guys were with him in the tent, but he was friends with another guy from New York City named Pete. They hadn't been there long when stories about weird creatures in the woods started to circulate amongst soldiers. One of the rumors was that a few soldiers had been attacked by an unknown beast within the camp. There wasn't a lot said, and no one, he believes, ever witnessed the attacks. One early morning, my grandfather and Pete, along with other soldiers, were transporting garbage to the area north of camp. He said that there were a large ditch where all the refuse was dumped. It was hauled in large barrels, which were emptied one by one. He was in the lead truck. As he pulled up to the dump area, he noticed a very large dog on the back edge of the ditch, which looked to be digging into the trash. They were commenting that the dog may have been a wolf because it was huge. While they were talking amongst themselves, the dog stood up on its two back legs and looked directly at them. After a few seconds, it turned and dropped to four legs and ran off into the woods. They were alarmed and considered leaving, but there were armed personnel on patrol. They then wondered why armed soldiers needed to guard a garbage dump. They quickly got their work done because they wanted to leave as soon as possible. My grandfather said he later had a conversation with one of the guys who had spent time guarding the garbage dump. And according to him, the higher-ups were aware of these large dogs, which he believed to be wolves. He said that there were similar beasts in the area, and that they were ordered to shoot to kill if they had the opportunity. He admitted that he witnessed one of these wolves stand up on two legs and walk, though he didn't say why he failed to shoot at it. My grandfather was later injured during training, but after 2 years he was cleared for assignment and served in the United States Army in Europe. He said that over the years he had talked with other vets who had trained at Fort Stewart. A few of them were aware of the attacks, and that it probably occurred on more than one occasion. Today's fourth encounter. This happened to me in January of 2014 on a back road of northeast Arkansas. At the time, I was a newspaper delivery driver. I picked up my papers from the press, usually around 12:15 in the morning. And it was about a 45-minute drive to get to the start of my route. At the time, I was a cigarette smoker, so after I bagged enough papers to sustain the route for a while, I'd light up a cigarette and roll down the window. Being cold, I tried to keep it up as much as possible because my car back then didn't have heat. There's a really long stretch of gravel road called Old Military Road near Harrisburg, Arkansas. On the left side of the road is mostly houses, and on the right side is a fence post and open pasture with barns and troughs for horses and cows. It's in the middle of nowhere, though. There are no street lights. Some people have floodlights in their yard. So I'm driving along with my windows down, smoking a cigarette. It's about 2:30. And beginning to smell a combination of burning hair and urine. Like, not a mixture of the two, but one and also another. It isn't a great smell. I toss the cigarette and roll my window up, but I can still smell whatever that awful smell is. The further I go down the road, the worse the smell gets. Usually, see some cows sleeping outside or horses chilling sometimes, but nothing tonight. So I know that I'm not the only one that picked up on something being weird that night. As I'm coming up to a fork in the road, I have to take a left. There's a big open field to the far right. I see what looks like a man with a deer's head. It was too dark for me to tell whether it was a man wearing a deer skull or an actual human deer cross, but it was definitely the source of whatever that smell was, and it scared the shit out of me, and I didn't want to hang out long enough to figure out exactly what it was. My perception, he was shoulder height 7 feet tall. The head probably added another foot. I don't know, but he was massive. There were definitely deer antlers, and the smell was disgusting. I saw him stretch his arms. Imagine flexing your arms and chest by making a wide C with your arm. His movement for 2 or 3 seconds, I just saw him, looked like a human. I found a new job by late January and started by February. Was not interested in ever being in that area again. Today's fifth encounter. I wasn't really sure what I saw was real, but after talking to some friends and reading up on the internet, I'm ready to tell my story. Now, keep in mind, I live in a small town of Milford, Michigan, and I've heard some bizarre stories. But I wasn't too sure about what they were describing. A tall creature that creeps on 4 legs until startled or entering chase, then proceeds to stand on 2. A tall, dark figure that looks like a dog, I thought. These people must be crazy. Deer can do some weird stuff. My friend recently described a story of an encounter about a year earlier. My friend, let's call him Sam, went outside to have a cigarette around 12 or 1 in the morning. His yard has a hill that slopes down from his circled driveway, all the way to a flat area near his basement door. If you walk out that basement directly in the front, you're in front of a pond, and to the left is a shed that they use. At first he noticed nothing, but as he looked closer he noticed a figure on all 4s. He took out his cell phone and shined his flashlight on this creature, and to his surprise the thing stood up on 2 legs, screeched at him, then ran off into the woods. He told us about his encounter the next morning and took us to the spot where he saw it. Sure enough, there were dog prints. That wasn't really unusual, though, because he lives next to a subdivision where we've already helped his neighbors find their dogs about 3 times since. So we shrugged it off. He then brought me into the woods where the creature ran into, and there was clearly a path that something had took. As much as Sam tried to convince me, I still thought it was a deer. That's until recently. Then, on December 24th, 2014, I went for a drive to go to Walmart to pick up some beer, just relax and hang out with friends. Everything was perfectly fine. The moon was out, so you could see just a little bit, and there was no snow or rain. Just a little dampness on the road from a previous rainfall about an hour before. I was on my way back to my house and driving up a curvy, hilly road, up to the top of the hill, the only one in my subdivision, and I noticed something in my neighbor's yard. Now I see deer in the subdivision all the time, and I've actually hit one on an occasion. So I decided to slow down. This thing was definitely the same size as a deer, so I didn't have any second thoughts. That is, until I got close and it ran in front of my car. Now, normally when a deer runs out in front of your car, they either freeze or run right by. And there are normally 2 or 3 of them. This was a single case, and when it ran across the road, albeit on 4 legs, it didn't run the same as a deer. When it ran, it didn't lift its head. It had a low to the ground and looked like it was sniffing something. It then lifted its head and looked, more like glared at me and bolted off. To the right of me, but not before, shortly after, stopping right out of my view. I could still see the figure standing there, but I couldn't make out what it was. All I could see was it was standing on its hind legs and what looked like it was staring at me. I kept trying to get my eyes to adjust from the brightness of my headlights to the dark side of the road, but it just wouldn't happen. When I tried to turn my car around so I could shine my headlights on it, it bolted down the hill into the woods, all the while staying on 2 legs. I still remember the face that I saw when this thing glared at me. It looked like a wolf, but it was the size of a buck. That was the scariest moment of my life, and I've never seen anything like it before. I Googled some information about it, and I found something about the Michigan Dogman, but I don't want to be classified as one of those crazies. I can still see it standing on its hind legs looking at me in the dark. Today's 6th encounter. I lived most of my life in a village named Malik Kiflik in Bulgaria. It wasn't a small place, but everybody knew each other, and everybody knew about weird stuff that would happen once in a while. But nobody spoke of it. My first encounter with strange happened when I was 7. It was nighttime, and my friends and I were at a park there. Our parents were at a nearby restaurant nearby, and some of the older kids were also at the park. At one point, I was alone, sitting on a slide, when the streetlights went out. So I'm sitting there in the dark, and I look at a house that's across the park. Above it is hovering a silver flying saucer. I watched it for 5 minutes before it disappeared. I decided not to tell anybody, but when I approached them, they asked me if I saw it. On that same night, about 12:30, my mom and I started heading home. As we were walking, we were nearing a turn onto a road near a little dirt road. On the right side of it leads to a couple of houses. Suddenly my mom stops. I ask her why, and she just shushes me. So I look at what she's looking at, and there's this man walking in front of us with really long arms that were reaching to his knees, and his head was turned 180 degrees looking at us. It disappeared at the turn of the road, and a couple of seconds later there was this bright light. We stood there for a bit before continuing. Even today, my mom rarely speaks of it. 2 months later, in the middle of the summer, most of my peers were gone on vacation or visiting other family. A couple of older kids wanted us to go and pick cherries at this large cherry tree belonging to a man that lived at the edge of the village. A few local adults, when they saw where we were heading, warned us not to go, but of course we didn't listen. Before we even reached the place, we heard some strange noises behind the bushes, so we decided to check it out. Past the bushes was an open field. On it was a dead cow, and feeding on that was an unknown creature that would fit the description of a dogman or a werewolf. It turned its head towards us. Its red eyes looked directly at me. It grimaced at us, showing all of its teeth. We started running and didn't stop until we reached the center of town. Later that same night, it's time for us to head home. The road that leads to my neighborhood is kind of surrounded by a forest. As I'm passing by a cornfield, I hear a growl from a little path that goes into it. I looked at the path and it's pitch dark. The only thing I can see is red eyes and a grimacing smile that starts to form. I started running and that thing chased me. It gains on me, and I swear it said, "You're mine," in a very deep, menacing voice. At this moment, my neighbor's dog started barking, and I see him rushing towards me up the road. Thanks to them, the creature had lost its momentum for a bit, and I managed to reach the gated fence. I climbed over and sprinted across the yard to my house. The dogs continued barking the whole while. Even today, 18 years later, I sometimes have nightmares about it. A few years later, in the evening, I was playing at a park when I looked up at the sky and saw a bright yellow star falling down. As I watched it suddenly stop and started doing some maneuvers before flying up and disappearing. 2 weeks later, a friend and I were near the place I encountered the beast when he spots the same object falling down in the distance. We watch it as it stops and hovers above the forest before landing. The next day, we are there again with a bunch of kids telling them about the star when we see the field next to the forest in flames, which would disappear and reappear on different spots. Today's 7th encounter. I grew up in New Mexico and I still live there. My whole life I've heard stories about skinwalkers, and I consider myself to be somewhat knowledgeable on the subject. I've always been interested in them and find them creepy yet fascinating, and I talk about them a lot, even though one of my Navajo friends insists I shouldn't, and always leaves the room when I bring up the topic. Anyway, I lived on a 3rd-floor apartment north of Albuquerque. The area of the city I lived in was rather busy that evening. There are lots of restaurants, businesses, and even a nearby shopping mall. One night I was chilling alone at the place, eating some cereal and watching Netflix. It was late, about 1 in the morning. I was ready to go to bed when I hear barking from outside of the window. This isn't uncommon in my apartment complex, as they do allow dogs that are under 40 pounds, but something was seriously wrong with the way this barking sounded. It was almost as if the dog was drowning or something, like half the barks were coming from underwater. I crept outside onto the balcony, and I could see the source of the noise. It certainly looked like a dog, except for the fact that it was enormous, like the size of one of those Russian Caucasian mountain dogs. I've seriously never seen a dog that big before in person. It was standing in a dimly lit grass courtyard area of my apartment. The lights were all dull yellow and the bulbs were really old, so I couldn't make out many details of the animal. All I could honestly tell was that it was really big, really furry, and that it seemed to be pointed in my direction. When I stepped out onto the balcony, the barking immediately stopped. I stared at the dog for a while, and it almost seemed like it was staring back at me. We stayed like this for maybe 2 minutes when I hear a loud honk from a car nearby. At this point, the dog stands up on its hind legs and sprints off toward the small Aurora near my complex. It was honestly extremely terrifying, and I've never come that close to actually pooping my own pants. Of course, my first thought was I just witnessed a skinwalker. The only thing is I've never ever read or heard about skinwalkers being in such a busy city or urban area. The scariest thing is that my Navajo friend has always told me that I need to stop talking about skinwalkers because it attracts their attention. So now I definitely feel paranoid. Today's 8th encounter. September 1990, I was 15. I had gotten up early on a Saturday morning to go squirrel hunting on a small piece of property near my parents' house. This stretch of woods was located in Greenup County, Kentucky, in the northeastern part of the state. The property is bordered by Raccoon Creek and the Little Sandy River. I've hunted this area on a daily basis when I was younger, and I've never seen anything unusual. On this particular day, early September, there was a heavy dew on the trees, so it was easy to hear anything move as the dew would fall and make a very distinct noise. I was walking down the ridge top overlooking Raccoon Creek and hadn't made any noise since arriving way before daylight. As often happened, my neighbor's dog followed me that day, and I thought I had ran him off a couple hours early. Everything was completely still, with almost no wind that morning. I started hearing a dog gruff and start barking and growling in the way that I had never heard before. At first I tried to ignore the noise, but after a few minutes I decided to go run him off again, as he was screwing up my hunt. As I quietly eased down the ridge about 50 yards, I saw what I thought was a young bear through the trees. The animal was standing on its back legs and was only about 6 feet tall. I noticed that as Gruffy would lunge at the animal, it would knock him back with its hand. He would let out a yelp and then go back after the animal. I eased closer, being as quiet as possible, as I planned to shoot near the animal to keep it from killing the dog. As I got directly above the animal, it noticed me and turned to look directly at me. This is when I noticed it was not a bear. I didn't immediately distinguish the animal as a Sasquatch, but was very confused at what I was looking at. The animal began to growl viciously, which scared me than I'd ever been. When Gruffy noticed me, he ran to me and kept barking at the animal. I thought about shooting the animal, but decided that a 20-gauge shotgun at that distance with .6 shot, that I would just piss it off. I started to walk backward, slowly. After 3 to 4 steps, the animal let out this blood-curdling growl. I literally threw my shotgun down and ran home. When I got home, I told my father about what happened. After he got over the fact that my gun is still in the woods, he decided to grab his rifle and take me back to get my gun. He wouldn't accept that this was anything other than a bear. I've never spoken about this encounter because if my father would not believe me, who else would? Although black bear are in the area, I've only seen one out in the wild. I've been hunting my entire life. I still am not entirely sure what I saw that day, but I know it wasn't a bear and it was not a human. A human couldn't possibly make the sound that animal was making at that volume. Today's final encounter. I live in northwestern side of Michigan, in Manistee, and continue to live in the same home. I was in my mid-teens when this originally happened. It was night. My bed was on one wall with a big window on the opposite. I was on the first floor of the house, but we lived on a hill, so it was slanted, and still pretty high window, 9 feet off the ground. Anyway, I woke up one Saturday night feeling really thirsty. It was about 2 in the morning, and everyone else in my house was asleep. I was about to crawl out of bed and go to the bathroom just down the hall when I looked out the window and froze. At the very bottom of the window, there was a really dark shape. It looked kind of like the top part of a timber wolf's head. It was big, with 2 pointed ears. I couldn't make out any other features, so while I was still scared at first, I thought it was just a reflection of something in my room. Then it moved. You know how dogs twitch their ears and perk them up when they're trying to hear better? That's what this thing did. The 2 points that I took for ears twitched and then came back to place. And it wasn't a subtle movement at all, so I knew it wasn't a reflection. So I immediately thought of the Dogman accounts I've heard in our area. I got really scared then, so I did what the typical kid does and pulled the covers over my head and went back to sleep without getting water. In the morning, I went outside by my window and noticed disturbed ground, like a man or something on 2 legs had been sitting there. No shoe prints, but what looked like elongated wolf prints. There were no marks on the side of the house. The thing that really stumps me is wondering how anything would manage to stay up by the window that's 9 feet off the ground in the first place. After all these years, I've caught a glimpse of a tall bipedal canine on 2 other occasions. The most recent was a few weeks ago, as I was in the yard mowing the grass when I saw it through the woods. I was terrified that this creature may be stalking my family. Well, there you have it, folks. Today's bonus upload. I hope you all enjoyed it as much as I enjoyed sharing it with you. I'd like to thank you for supporting the channel. It is your support, after all, that keeps the channel growing and going, and honestly, what gives people a chance and a place to share their experiences and theories judgment-free, simply treated with the respect that we all deserve. Thank you. Please stay safe, happy, healthy, and ever vigilant, keeping an eye on our children, pets, family, and friends. These creatures are real. They are out there and dangerous. Share this information with those you love and care about, and it may just help save their lives someday. Until next time, never stop asking questions, never stop searching for the answers, and God bless.